Sarah sat in the waiting area outside the courtroom, her small frame engulfed by an oversized gray sweater that had once belonged to her father. The sweater smelled like his cologne, a scent that used to bring her comfort but now only reminded her of how absent he had been when she needed him most. He worked overseas, and by the time her mother had discovered the truth and called him in a panic, the legal machinery had already begun its relentless forward momentum. At 12 years old, Sarah had already learned lessons that no child should ever have to learn. That the world wasn't always safe, that adults who were supposed to protect you could become your greatest threat, and that words could be dangerous weapons in the wrong hands. For 3 years, she had carried the secret alone. 3 years of pretending everything was normal when it absolutely wasn't. 3 years of wearing long sleeves in the summer, of flinching when her stepfather reached out to touch her shoulder, of locking the bathroom door and standing under scalding water trying to wash away the shame that wasn't hers to carry. She had almost believed her own lies, the ones she told herself late at night when sleep wouldn't come, when the anxiety gnawed at her chest like an animal trying to escape a cage. She had convinced herself that if she just stayed quiet, if she just endured, if she just made herself smaller and more invisible, then maybe it would stop. Maybe it would all just go away. But secrets have a way of eating you from the inside out. The trauma had buried itself so deep within Sarah's psyche that some days she felt like she was operating from behind thick glass, watching her own life unfold but not quite participating in it. She had stopped raising her hand in class. She had quit the soccer team she loved. She had withdrawn from her friends, making excuses about being busy or tired or sick. Her mother had noticed the changes, of course, but Sarah had become a master of deflection, of creating plausible explanations that didn't require her to reveal the truth. She told her mother she was just stressed about school. She told her teachers she wasn't feeling well. She told herself it was all fine, even as her body betrayed her with stress-related illnesses, insomnia, and an anxiety that felt like a constant companion. The courthouse hallway smelled like antiseptic and old wood, like countless stories of human suffering had seeped into its very walls. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with a sound that made Sarah's skin crawl. Everything about this place felt cold and institutional and utterly terrifying. She had never been in a real courtroom before, had never imagined she would need to be. The only courtrooms she knew were the ones from television shows, where dramatic speeches and passionate monologues seemed to settle everything neatly within an hour. But this wasn't television. This was her life, and nothing about it felt neat or settled. Sarah's assigned victim advocate, Mrs., sat beside her with a cup of coffee in one hand and a folder full of case documents in the other. Mrs. had kind eyes and spoke in a voice that never rose above a gentle tone, but Sarah could sense the protective fierceness beneath her calm exterior. She had explained to Sarah multiple times over the past few weeks what would happen in the courtroom, how the process would work, what kinds of questions she might be asked. She had assured her that she didn't have to be perfect, didn't have to remember every detail, didn't have to perform her trauma for anyone. But the reality of what was about to happen still felt impossible. "You don't have to do this today if you're not ready," Mrs. whispered, squeezing Sarah's hand gently with her free hand. The gesture was meant to be comforting, but it only intensified the knot of anxiety in Sarah's stomach. They both knew that wasn't true. They both knew the trial couldn't be delayed any longer. The stepfather's defense had already filed multiple motions requesting extensions, and the judge had grown impatient. Justice couldn't wait forever, even though waiting was all Sarah wanted to do. She wanted to wait until she was older, stronger, braver. She wanted to wait until the shame had somehow transformed into something less heavy. She wanted to wait until she could speak about what had happened without feeling like she was going to vomit. Sarah's therapist, doctor, had diagnosed her with selective mutism, the inability to speak in certain situations despite having full capability to do so. It was a condition that manifested as pure anxiety, as her throat closing up involuntarily when faced with trauma-related conversations, as her voice simply disappearing whenever she tried to articulate the worst parts of what had happened to her. In their sessions, Doctor had taught her breathing techniques and grounding exercises, had encouraged her to write down her feelings when she couldn't speak them, had validated her responses as normal reactions to abnormal circumstances. But none of that felt particularly helpful now, sitting in this waiting area with the weight of the world pressing down on her small shoulders. The pressure was immense, invisible but absolutely tangible. The stepfather's defense team was already claiming that the allegations were fabricated, that Sarah was confused or being coached by her mother, that her mother was weaponizing a child in the midst of a custody dispute. Never mind that there had been physical evidence, medical examinations, mandatory reporter statements from her school counselor. Never mind that Sarah had finally broken down and told her mother what had been happening, the words pouring out in a flood of sobs and broken sentences. The defense was painting a narrative of a vindictive ex-wife and a confused child, and they were doing it well. Sarah had heard her mother on the phone with the prosecutor, heard the desperation in her voice as she pleaded with him to believe her daughter, to believe that this was real. Without Sarah's testimony, conviction would be nearly impossible. That's what everyone kept saying. The prosecutor needed her to be credible, to be clear, to be believable. But Sarah didn't feel credible. She felt broken and small and incapable of articulating the most important truth of her life. She felt like she was being asked to perform a role she was completely unprepared for, to navigate a system designed by adults in ways that no child should have to navigate. Sarah looked down at her hands, noticing that her fingernails were bitten down to the quick, a habit she had developed over the past few weeks. Her knuckles were white from gripping the armrest of the chair. She could feel her heart racing in her chest, could feel the sweat beginning to form on her palms despite the cool temperature of the hallway. Her mother sat on her other side, occasionally reaching over to tuck a strand of hair behind Sarah's ear, a gesture that Sarah knew was meant to be soothing, but that only reminded her of how helpless they both felt. The clock on the wall ticked forward, each second bringing her closer to the moment when she would have to walk into that courtroom and face her stepfather across a room full of strangers. The moment when she would have to try to articulate the unspeakable. The moment when her voice, or her inability to find one, would determine whether justice could be served or whether he would walk free, able to hurt other children, able to live as though what he had done had never happened. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to breathe, but the weight of silence pressed down on her like a physical force, suffocating and inescapable. Sarah's eyes followed the German shepherd as he moved past her with his handler, the dog's massive frame and commanding presence somehow paradoxically radiating calm instead of threat. In her life, she had learned to be wary of large figures, to flinch at sudden movements, to interpret proximity as danger. But something about this dog was fundamentally different. There was an intelligence in Justice's dark eyes, a gentleness in the way he carried himself despite his size and power. Most children in her situation, those who had experienced what she had experienced, had been carefully instructed not to interact with unfamiliar people or animals, to remain quiet and compliant, to draw as little attention to themselves as possible. The advice made sense in theory. Don't talk to strangers. Don't invite conversation. Don't create opportunities for further harm. But something about Justice caught her attention in a way that overrode the careful protective walls she had constructed around herself. Sarah watched as Officer and Justice continued down the hallway toward the courtroom, and she felt a peculiar sensation of loss as they disappeared from view. It was an unexpected emotion, sudden and almost surprising in its intensity. She had spent so long feeling numb, so accustomed to the weight of her trauma that she had nearly forgotten what it felt like to experience desire or longing for something external to herself. But in those few seconds as she watched the dog pass, she had felt it, a yearning for something that seemed almost like safety, almost like understanding. Mrs. had stepped away briefly to speak with a prosecutor about some last-minute procedural details, leaving Sarah alone in the waiting area with her mother, who was staring at the courthouse floor with the exhausted expression of someone who had already fought every battle she had in her to fight. Sarah's mother had been her fiercest advocate throughout this entire ordeal, but even her strength seemed depleted now, worn thin by months of fighting to protect her daughter and navigate a system that seemed designed to victims rather than support them. Sarah could see the toll this had taken on her mother, the gray hairs that hadn't been there a year ago, the new lines around her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking. Sarah sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair, her feet dangling slightly above the ground, a physical reminder of her smallness, her vulnerability, her child's status in a legal system designed by and for adults. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears, a rhythmic reminder that her body was in a state of acute distress, even though the immediate threat wasn't physical. This was the anxiety that Doctor had tried so hard to help her understand and manage. The way her nervous system remained locked in fight-or-flight mode, even in situations that posed no tangible danger. Then she heard the sound of paws clicking on the linoleum floor, and she looked up to see Officer and Justice returning down the hallway. This time, they seemed to be approaching her waiting area rather than continuing past. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. She wasn't sure if this was a good thing or a frightening thing. She had been taught to be cautious of police, to understand that while they were meant to help, they could also complicate situations or disbelieve her narrative. But this officer seemed different somehow. His expression was kind, his movements unhurried and thoughtful. Officer approached slowly, deliberately, making sure to give Sarah and her mother time to process his presence. "Hi there," he said gently, keeping his voice low and calm. "This is Justice. He's a K-9 officer and we work together. Would you be interested in meeting him?" It was phrased as a question, offering Sarah agency in a situation where she had felt agency slipping away for 3 years. She could say no. She could refuse. The officer wasn't forcing anything upon her. Sarah looked at Justice more closely now. The dog was sitting calmly beside his handler, his ears alert but not aggressive, his eyes focused on Sarah with an expression that seemed almost familiar, almost understanding. There was something about the dog that transcended the typical animal-to-human interaction. Justice seemed to see her, not just to look at her, but to actually perceive her in a way that felt almost profound. Sarah's mother placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, offering silent permission. Sarah had never been particularly vocal or outgoing. Her selective mutism was only the most recent manifestation of a general tendency towards silence and introspection. But when she looked at Justice, something shifted in her. Her voice, when it finally emerged after weeks of painful silence, was barely a whisper, almost inaudible, but it was there. The words existed. She spoke them. "He's beautiful." It was the first complete sentence she had spoken to an adult in weeks. The words hung in the air, fragile and precious, like a bird that might fly away if she wasn't careful. Officer's expression softened with recognition of what this moment meant. He understood, perhaps intuitively or perhaps from experience, that this small vocalization represented something far more significant than simple observation about a dog's appearance. "Would you like to pet him?" asked, his voice maintaining that same gentle, non-pressuring tone. Sarah nodded, unable to generate more words. She stood up from her chair, and Mrs. watched with visible emotion as the girl took a tentative step toward the massive German shepherd. Officer knelt down slightly, positioning Justice in a way that made the dog less intimidating, a calculated move that spoke to his deep understanding of trauma and fear responses. Justice remained perfectly still. It was a remarkable display of training and temperament, but more than that, it seemed to be an active choice on the dog's part to be safe and supportive. Sarah's hand reached out slowly, trembling slightly, and made contact with Justice's soft fur. The moment her small hand touched the dog's body, something shifted in the girl. Her rigid shoulders began to relax slightly, as if a tension that had been wound through her entire body for months was finally finding a release valve. Her breathing deepened and slowed, the hyperventilation that had been her constant companion becoming more measured and controlled. Her entire expression seemed to shift from terror to something that looked almost like fragile peace. Justice, sensing her emotional state with that supernatural intuition that had come to recognize over years of partnership, remained absolutely still. The dog didn't try to play or jump or initiate typical dog behaviors. Instead, Justice simply existed beside this traumatized child, offering his presence as a form of silent communication that seemed to transcend words. The dog's warmth, his steady heartbeat that Sarah could feel beneath her hand, his calm and accepting demeanor, all of it communicated something that no therapist's breathing exercises or grounding techniques could quite capture. In those few minutes, something fundamental shifted in Sarah. The wall she had constructed to protect herself, the careful defensive mechanisms that had kept her isolated and silent, began to develop small cracks. Not enough to come tumbling down, not enough to make her vulnerable to new harm, but enough to allow something like hope to slip through. Justice's quiet, non-demanding presence created a space where Sarah didn't feel judged or questioned or pressured to perform her trauma in a particular way. For the first time since this nightmare began, in a waiting area outside a courtroom where she would soon be asked to relive her worst experiences, Sarah felt like she wasn't completely alone. Mrs. and Sarah's mother exchanged a glance filled with understanding. They both recognized that they were witnessing something important, something that might just change the trajectory of everything that was about to unfold. Officer, watching the transformation in the girl, understood that Justice had done what no human intervention could quite accomplish. He had offered her a pathway back to connection, back to feeling, back to the possibility of speaking her truth. The courtroom was cold and imposing, a temple to a system of justice that had been built over centuries, but that seemed fundamentally designed to intimidate rather than support. The wood paneling was dark and heavy, the vaulted ceiling soaring above in a way that made Sarah feel even smaller than her already diminutive frame suggested. The room was filled with the machinery of justice that felt as threatening as the crime itself. The judge's elevated bench, the jury box with its 12 strangers who would decide her stepfather's fate, the prosecution and defense tables positioned like opposing armies ready for battle. Every architectural element seemed calculated to assert authority and power, to remind everyone in the room that they were subject to forces larger than themselves. Sarah sat in the witness stand, positioned uncomfortably in a chair that seemed designed for adults rather than children, her hands trembling visibly as she placed them on the table before her. She had been told not to put them in her lap, not to hide them, not to do anything that might suggest she was being evasive or dishonest. Everything about her body language was being evaluated, interpreted, and judged. She could feel the weight of attention from every corner of the room. The prosecutor, who was hopping, she could articulate her suffering clearly enough to convince a jury. The judge, who was trying to remain impartial while also appearing sympathetic. The court reporter recording every word, or in Sarah's case, every painful silence, and the gallery of observers who had come to witness this trial unfold. The prosecutor began with gentle questions, his voice carefully modulated to convey support and understanding. He asked her name, her age, what grade she was in at school. These were softball questions designed to get her comfortable with speaking, to establish a rapport before moving into the difficult territory. But even these simple questions felt monumental to Sarah. Her throat felt tight, and each word required her to push past layers of resistance. The prosecutor was experienced with child testimony, had worked with trauma survivors before, and he could see the panic beginning to rise in Sarah's eyes. Then the prosecutor asked the first substantive question about what had happened, and Sarah's voice simply locked away. It was as if her throat had been welded shut, as if her mouth had forgotten how to form words. This was the selective mutism that doctor had warned her about, the involuntary response of her nervous system to perceived threat. Sarah opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She opened it again, still nothing. She could see the concern on the prosecutor's face, could see the jury members leaning back slightly in their chairs, could sense the entire room recalibrating their assessment of her credibility. She could see her stepfather across the room, and something about his expression made her stomach clench. He was sitting next to his expensive lawyer, a man named Richard who had a reputation for being ruthless with witnesses, particularly child witnesses. Had a strategy, and it was becoming increasingly clear, undermine the credibility of the primary witness. If he could make Sarah seem confused, unreliable, coached, or emotionally unstable, then reasonable doubt would follow as a matter of course. Sarah's stepfather's expression suggested confidence, almost arrogance, as if he believed his financial resources and legal representation had already guaranteed his freedom. The defense attorney stood and approached the witness stand for the cross-examination, and Sarah felt her anxiety spike to a new level entirely. Was a tall man with sharp features and an aggressive demeanor that he seemed to deliberately project. He began with seemingly innocuous questions about dates and times, questions designed to catch her in inconsistencies. You said this happened in March, but earlier you mentioned it was spring break. When exactly was spring break that year? The questions seemed designed less to elicit information and more to confuse and frustrate. With each aggressive question, Sarah's ability to speak seemed to evaporate further, as if hostile energy was literally draining her of the capacity to articulate words. He suggested that her memories were unreliable, that children were prone to misremembering or conflating different events. He implied that she had been coached by her mother, who had a financial motive in divorcing Sarah's stepfather and gaining full custody. He suggested that Sarah was seeking attention, that she had fabricated these allegations to punish him for some perceived slight, or because her mother had influenced her through suggestive questioning. Each accusation landed like a physical blow. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, felt her breathing becoming increasingly ragged and panicked. The prosecutor objected repeatedly, but was operating within the bounds of what was permitted by the rules of evidence. He was doing his job, doing it well, and Sarah was crumbling under the pressure. Mrs. watched from the gallery with her heart breaking visibly. She had seen this before, had witnessed how the legal system could victims while claiming to pursue justice. She could see Sarah shutting down completely, could see the girl withdrawing into herself the same way she had in the weeks before Officer and Justice had appeared in that waiting area. The moment of opportunity was slipping away. The judge leaned forward, concern crossing her face as she observed Sarah's deteriorating state. Judge Henderson had been on the bench for 16 years and had seen countless child abuse cases. She understood intuitively that if something didn't change, this testimony was going to collapse entirely, taking the prosecution's case with it. She was sympathetic to Sarah's plight, but also bound by the rules of evidence and procedure. She couldn't simply stop the defense from conducting cross-examination, couldn't protect Sarah from the inherent trauma of having to defend herself against accusations of lying. This was the critical moment, the turning point that would determine whether justice could be served or whether Sarah's 3 years of suffering would result in her abuser walking free. Without Sarah's testimony, presented in a way that the jury would find credible and compelling, the case would crumble. The stepfather would be acquitted, would be able to return to his life as though none of this had happened, would potentially be able to harm other children. Sarah would be forced to live in the same world as her abuser, would carry the additional trauma of not being believed by the legal system designed to protect her. The judge called for a recess, recognizing that they had reached an impasse. The attorneys approached the bench for a sidebar conference, their voices too low for Sarah to hear from the witness stand. She sat there, trembling, feeling utterly devastated and alone. She had tried. She had come here and tried to speak her truth, and she was failing. The system was grinding her down, was making her feel crazy and unreliable, was suggesting that maybe she had imagined it all or remembered it wrong. Officer, who had been sitting in the back of the courtroom with Justice, observed all of this with growing distress. He understood what was happening. He had seen it before in his years of law enforcement work. He watched as Judge Henderson gestured for him to approach the bench, watched as she seemed to be asking him something, watched as her expression shifted from frustration to contemplation, and then to cautious hope. It was during this sidebar conversation that the most unusual request was made, a request that would be questioned by some legal scholars but ultimately praised by many more. Judge Henderson, in her experience and wisdom, was willing to try something unconventional. She was willing to allow something that had never been permitted in her courtroom before. She was willing to allow justice into the witness box. When the courtroom reconvened after the recess, there was a palpable tension in the air that everyone could sense but few could articulate. The bailiff had made an unusual announcement, one that had never been made in Judge Henderson's courtroom before. The judge had granted an accommodation for a traumatized minor witness, and a police K-9 would be positioned near the witness stand to provide emotional support during testimony. There were immediate murmurs from the gallery, skeptical looks exchanged between the defense team and the prosecution, questions written on the faces of the jury members about what this meant and whether it was appropriate. Richard, the defense attorney, immediately objected strenuously. He argued that the presence of a police dog would prejudice the jury, would create sympathy for the witness, would violate the rules of evidence and proper courtroom procedure. But Judge Henderson had anticipated these objections and had prepared her response. She explained that the accommodation was being made under the state's victim protection statutes and her inherent authority to manage the courtroom in a way that served the interests of justice. The dog would not testify, would not provide evidence, would simply exist as a neutral presence to help stabilize a traumatized witness. It was unconventional, but not unprecedented, and it fell within the scope of judicial discretion. Subjections were overruled. The judge's decision stood. Officer led Justice into the courtroom with measured steps. The dog wore his official vest, and his demeanor was professional and calm. Justice seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, seemed to sense that this was something important, something that required his absolute focus and best behavior. The jury watched as the German Shepherd was positioned near the witness stand, close enough that Sarah could see him without craning her neck, far enough away that he wasn't intimidating or distracting. Sarah's eyes found Justice immediately, and the moment they made contact, something shifted in her entire being. It was as if a connection that had been established in that waiting area had suddenly reactivated, suddenly reminded her that she was not alone in this room full of strangers and hostile questioning. The physical symptoms of her anxiety, the racing heart, the shallow breathing, the tightness in her throat, didn't disappear entirely, but they became slightly more manageable. She felt a tiny degree of stability, an anchor point in a sea of trauma and confusion. The prosecutor resumed his questioning, approaching the witness stand slowly and deliberately. "Sarah," he said gently, "I know this is very difficult. I want you to take a moment and look at Justice. Then I'm going to ask you to tell the jury in your own words what happened. You can take your time. There's no rush. Can you do that?" Sarah looked at Justice. The dog's eyes met hers, and she saw in them something that seemed almost like encouragement, almost like the dog was saying, "You can do this. I'm here. Tell the truth." Sarah opened her mouth. The words still didn't come easily. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was halting and uncertain, barely above a whisper. But it was there. The words existed. She began to describe what had happened, starting with the first time her stepfather had come into her room, starting with the shame and confusion she had felt as a 12-year-old who didn't fully understand what was happening to her body or why an adult was doing these things. The courtroom was completely silent. There were no coughs, no shuffling papers, no whispered conversations. Everyone was listening. The jury members' expressions had shifted from skepticism to visible pain as they heard what this child was describing. Sarah's mother was crying silently in the gallery, her hand covering her mouth as she heard her daughter finally articulate the suffering she had been carrying alone. Sarah described the ways her stepfather had threatened her, The ways he had told her that if she told anyone, he would hurt her mother, that he would take her away from her home, that no one would believe her anyway because he was a well-respected member of the community. She described the physical pain, the emotional confusion, the way she had internalized the belief that somehow this was her fault, that she had done something to cause it, that she deserved it. Each time her voice began to falter, each time she felt the panic rising in her chest, she looked at Justice. The dog remained perfectly still, his eyes steady and present. Officer had instructed Justice before entering the courtroom, had whispered something to the dog that seemed to communicate the importance of what was about to happen. Justice honored that instruction with the kind of discipline that came from years of training and a deep bond with his handler. When the prosecutor finished his questioning, there was a moment of profound stillness. Then Richard stood to resume his cross-examination. Sarah felt her anxiety spike again as the aggressive defense attorney approached. But this time, something was different. Sarah had spoken her truth once. She had found that her voice still existed, that it was possible to articulate the unspeakable. She was no longer in the position of a victim who hadn't yet spoken. She was now a witness who had already about her own experience. Began again with his aggressive questioning, attempting to poke holes in her testimony to suggest inconsistencies or coached responses. But Sarah held firm. When he suggested that she was confused about dates, she responded with specificity about what she remembered. When he implied that her mother had influenced her testimony, she looked him directly in the eye and said, "My mom didn't tell me what to say. I'm telling you what happened to me." When he suggested that she was seeking attention or fabricating allegations, she felt her stepfather's eyes on her, felt the old shame and fear trying to silence her. That's when she looked at Justice again, and in that moment, something crystallized in her understanding. She understood that the dog wasn't just a comfort object or an emotional support animal in the traditional sense. Justice was a symbol of truth, of protection, of the idea that there were people and animals in this world who existed to serve justice and protect the vulnerable. Justice represented the possibility that her voice mattered, that her truth was worth hearing. Officer, standing near the dog, did something subtle but profound. He pointed at Justice and said quietly, words that were technically directed at the dog but that Sarah understood were really meant for her. "Justice sees you." Sarah looked at the dog, and something in her understood that message completely. She turned back to the attorney who was attempting to dismantle her testimony, and she pointed at Justice herself. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her, from a place of unexpected courage, from a place that had been buried beneath 3 years of silence and shame, she spoke the 2 words that would change everything. "I'm sure." It was not a shout or a dramatic declaration. It was quiet, measured, and absolutely certain. Those 2 words contained within them all of Sarah's courage, all of her determination to tell the truth, all of her refusal to be silenced or manipulated or made to doubt her own experience. Those 2 words represented the moment when a traumatized child transformed into a credible witness, when fear gave way to clarity, when silence was finally broken by truth. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The jury members' expressions hardened into something that looked like resolve. The judge leaned back in her chair, a slight nod of acknowledgement on her face. And in the gallery, Mrs. and Sarah's mother exchanged a glance that communicated the understanding that something fundamental had shifted. The momentum of the trial had changed. The tide was turning. Sarah continued her testimony with renewed strength, answering each of the remaining questions with clarity and specificity. She no longer sounded like a confused or manipulated child. She sounded like a young person speaking her truth, supported by something that transcended conventional courtroom procedure, empowered by a dog who had seen her and refused to let her be diminished or silenced. Justice remained at his post throughout the rest of the testimony, a silent witness to a child reclaiming her voice and her power. And in that courtroom, everyone understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, not just a legal proceeding, but a moment of profound human healing. Those 2 words, simple, declarative, and spoken with absolute conviction, became the turning point that transformed the entire trajectory of the trial. Sarah's finger, pointing at Justice and then turning back to face her stepfather directly, seemed to inject steel into her testimony in a way that nothing else could have accomplished. The visual image of the child pointing at the dog, claiming her truth, and declaring her certainty would be remembered by everyone in that courtroom for the rest of their lives. It was the moment when victim became witness, when silence became voice, when fear transformed into clarity. With renewed determination that seemed almost superhuman in its emergence from such a small frame, Sarah answered every remaining question with a clarity and specificity that was impossible to dismiss. She described dates not by month, but by connection to other events. She remembered it was the week before her birthday party, the day after her soccer tournament, the afternoon when her mother was working late. She described the stepfather's specific words, his threats, the particular ways he had manipulated her into silence. She described the physical sensations, the emotional confusion, the shame that had burrowed so deeply into her psyche that she had almost come to believe it was part of her fundamental identity. The jury watched this transformation with visible emotion. Several jurors had tears streaming down their faces. What they were witnessing was not a confused or coached child being manipulated by a vindictive parent. What they were witnessing was a traumatized young girl finding the courage to speak her reality into existence, finding the strength to contradict the narrative that her abuser had imposed upon her, finding her voice in a system that had seemed designed to silence her. Richard, the defense attorney, sensed the shift in the room's energy with the precision of someone who had spent 2 decades reading jury reactions. He pressed harder, attempting desperately to shake her testimony, to recover the advantage that had seemed so assured just hours earlier. He suggested that Sarah was performing, that she was being coached through subtle gestures from the prosecutor, that the presence of the dog was somehow manipulating her responses. But each attempted attack only seemed to strengthen Sarah's resolve. She didn't become defensive or emotional in ways that would undermine her credibility. Instead, she remained calm, specific, and absolutely certain. Sarah's stepfather's expression, which had been one of confident arrogance at the beginning of the trial, changed dramatically as he watched his carefully constructed defense crumble in real time. The man had believed that his financial resources, his social status, his expensive lawyer, and his ability to intimidate would protect him. He had believed that a child's voice, tentative, traumatized, struggling with selective mutism, would be no match for his legal arsenal. But he was watching that belief dissolve moment by moment. He watched as his lawyer's questions failed to rattle the girl, watched as the jury's faces hardened against him, watched as the judge's expression shifted from neutral to something that looked almost like judgment. By the time exhausted his cross-examination questions and Sarah was finally released from the witness stand, the entire landscape of the trial had fundamentally altered. The prosecution had other witnesses to call, teachers who had noticed behavioral changes in Sarah, a school counselor who had received her initial disclosure, medical professionals who could testify about physical findings consistent with abuse. But none of those witnesses needed to carry the weight of the case anymore. Sarah had already carried it. She had already done the impossible work of speaking her truth. Officer guided Justice out of the courtroom as Sarah stepped down from the witness stand. The dog seemed to understand that his work was complete, that his job had been accomplished. As they passed Sarah, Justice caught the girl's eye one final time, and Sarah felt something release in her chest. Not the trauma, not the pain, but the suffocating weight of silence that had been compressing her for 3 years. Mrs. met Sarah in the hallway outside the courtroom with her arms open, and Sarah collapsed into the embrace of this woman who had fought so hard to protect her throughout this ordeal. Her mother was there too, holding both of them, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to contain all the pain and fear and helplessness that a parent experiences when their child has been victimized. In the days that followed, As the prosecution and defense presented their remaining evidence, the momentum of the trial remained with the prosecution. The stepfather's legal team attempted to mitigate the damage, to suggest alternative explanations, to cast doubt on Sarah's reliability. But the jury had already heard her speak. They had already witnessed the transformation from traumatized silence to courageous truth-telling. They had already seen the moment when a child pointed at a dog and claimed her certainty with a voice that had been stolen from her for 3 years. The closing arguments were compelling on both sides, but the outcome seemed inevitable. The prosecution's closing emphasized Sarah's courage, her specificity, her unwavering consistency despite aggressive cross-examination. They emphasized that a child has nothing to gain by coming forward, that trauma-informed experts understand why children often take years to disclose abuse, that the very fact that Sarah had struggled to speak only added to her credibility rather than undermining it. The defense's closing attempted to resurrect doubt, to suggest reasonable alternatives to guilt, to position the child as a confused or manipulated victim of a flawed system, but even seemed to lack his earlier conviction. He was going through the motions of a strategy that had already been rendered ineffective by the power of Sarah's testimony. The stepfather sat at the defense table, his expression now one of grim resignation rather than confident arrogance. He understood what was coming. His lawyer understood what was coming. Everyone in the courtroom understood what was coming. The jury deliberated for just over 5 hours. This wasn't a long deliberation by any measure. Many cases took days or weeks of jury deliberation. But in cases of child abuse, 5 hours was sufficient time for 12 people who had heard a credible child victim describe her trauma to reach consensus. 5 hours was enough time to discuss the evidence, to talk through their doubts, to ultimately arrive at the conclusion that a child had spoken the truth, and that a man who had abused that child needed to be held accountable. When the bailiff returned to announce that the jury had reached a verdict, the courtroom filled with tension that was almost palpable. The stepfather stood, and for a moment his expression flickered with something that might have been hope, might have been prayer, might have been a final desperate wish that the jury would have found reasonable doubt in the spaces between Sarah's words. "We, the jury, on the count of sexual abuse of a minor, find the defendant guilty," the jury foreman read, his voice steady and certain. The words continued, "Guilty on additional counts, guilty on the charge of intimidation of a minor witness, guilty on the charge of threatening bodily harm to a family member." By the end of the verdicts, the stepfather had been found guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in quiet tears and exhaled breaths. Sarah, sitting between Mrs. and her mother in the gallery, felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Relief. Not happiness, not peace, but relief. The release of pressure, the end of uncertainty, the validation that she had spoken the truth, and that the legal system, despite its many flaws and limitations, had ultimately listened to her. The stepfather was led away in handcuffs by the bailiff, his face now a mask of fury and disbelief. He had believed his power, his position, his ability to intimidate, and his expensive legal representation would protect him. He had been wrong, and in being wrong, he had been held accountable. Justice, waiting in the hallway outside the courtroom with officer, seemed to understand that something significant had been accomplished. The dog's tail wagged gently, and somewhere in the courthouse, a child who had found her voice because of a German shepherd's quiet presence was beginning to believe that healing might actually be possible. The weeks following the guilty verdict were a blur of activity, emotion, and unexpected attention. Sarah had thought that the trial would be the culmination of her ordeal, the moment when everything would be resolved and she could finally begin to heal. But what she quickly discovered was that the trial was only one chapter in a much longer narrative. The verdict was a beginning, not an ending, a beginning of accountability, a beginning of her own processing and recovery, a beginning of a conversation that would extend far beyond the courtroom walls. The story began to circulate through legal circles almost immediately. Legal experts, victim advocates, and criminal justice professionals started discussing what had happened in Judge Henderson's courtroom. Not just the verdict, but the unprecedented accommodation that had made the verdict possible. Articles appeared in legal journals analyzing the role of justice, the K-9, in trauma-informed approaches to child testimony. Some pieces praised the innovation. Others raised concerns about precedent and the appropriate role of animals in the judicial process. A heated debate emerged about whether allowing a K-9 in the courtroom constituted a violation of the defendant's due process rights, or whether it represented a necessary accommodation for a vulnerable witness. The media latched onto the story with the kind of enthusiasm that often accompanies human interest narratives with emotional resonance. Local news outlets ran segments about the trial, focusing particularly on the dramatic moment when Sarah pointed at justice and spoke those two transformative words. National news programs picked up the story, seeing in it the kind of narrative that appealed to broad audiences: a vulnerable child, a faithful dog, a broken legal system finding an innovative solution. Sarah's face appeared on television screens across the country, though her identity had been protected by the court's orders regarding minors in abuse cases. Still, her story was out there, being discussed, being debated, being transformed into a symbol of something larger than her individual experience. Officer found himself unexpectedly thrust into the role of public spokesperson for the K-9 unit. He had been invited to speak at law enforcement conferences, to appear on podcast interviews, to discuss his work with justice and the broader implications of K-9 support animals in trauma-informed approaches to justice. Was reluctant initially. He was a police officer, not a media personality, and he preferred the quiet work of doing his job without fanfare. But he also recognized that this was an opportunity to advocate for changes that could benefit other child victims. He began saying yes to speaking engagements, began articulating a vision for how law enforcement could better support traumatized witnesses in the pursuit of justice. Justice, despite his humble nature and his inclination toward the simple life of a working dog, became something of a minor celebrity in law enforcement circles. Received requests from police departments across the country asking about K-9 support programs, inquiring about how they might implement similar protocols with their own service animals. The dog had inadvertently become the face of a movement toward more trauma-informed justice practices. Behind the scenes, away from the media attention and legal debates, Sarah was beginning the long and difficult work of actual healing. The trial had been a victory, but it had not erased the trauma or made the pain disappear. If anything, the process of testifying had required her to relive her trauma in granular detail, to articulate experiences she had spent 3 years trying to forget. She was having nightmares where she was back on the witness stand, where the questions wouldn't stop, where no one believed her. She was having panic attacks in unexpected moments, in the grocery store, at school, in her own bedroom at night. The relief she had felt at the verdict was real, but it existed alongside continued suffering. Doctor increased the frequency of Sarah's therapy sessions to twice weekly. The work they did together was deeper now, more intensive, focused on processing the trauma and the complex emotions surrounding the trial and its outcome. Sarah began writing in a journal, something Doctor had suggested as a way to externalize thoughts and feelings that remained difficult to verbalize. The pages of the journal were filled with confusion and pain, but also with moments of clarity and the beginning of self-compassion. Sarah's mother sought her own therapy, recognizing that she too had been traumatized by the experience of discovering her daughter's abuse and navigating the legal system. The guilt of not knowing sooner, the fear that she might not have protected Sarah adequately, the anger at the man who had invaded their family and broken their lives, all of these emotions needed to be processed with professional support. Mother and daughter began attending family therapy sessions as well, working to rebuild their relationship and the trust that had been fractured by the experience. At school, Sarah's teachers noticed subtle changes. She remained quiet and introverted by nature, but the paralytic anxiety that had characterized her behavior before the trial began to gradually diminish. She raised her hand in class occasionally. She rejoined the soccer team, though she found that her earlier passion for the sport had been diminished by trauma. She made a small attempt at reconnecting with a former friend, though rebuilding relationships that had been abandoned during her darkest months proved more complicated than simply deciding to try. The sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks after the verdict. The stepfather was brought into the courtroom in shackles, his expression now one of resignation rather than arrogance. The judge heard victim impact statements, first from Sarah, who read a carefully prepared statement that her therapist and mother had helped her compose, then from Sarah's mother, whose voice shook with emotion as she described the impact of her daughter's abuse on their entire family. Sarah's statement was powerful in its simplicity. She didn't rage or demand vengeance. She simply spoke about what she had lost, her sense of safety, her childhood innocence, her ability to trust adults who were supposed to protect her. She spoke about what the legal process had cost her, the anxiety, the nightmares, the difficulty of having to articulate unspeakable things. But she also spoke about what she had learned, that her voice mattered, that telling the truth had value, that she was not defined by what had been done to her. Judge Henderson sentenced the stepfather to 28 years in prison, a sentence that reflected the seriousness of his crimes and the trauma he had inflicted. As the bailiff led him from the courtroom for the final time, Sarah felt the weight of his presence lifting from her life in a tangible way. He would spend decades behind bars. He would not be able to hurt anyone else. He would not be able to intimidate or threaten or manipulate his way back into society. In the weeks that followed the sentencing, things gradually began to settle into a new normal. The media attention faded as new stories captured the public's interest. The legal debates about K-9s in courtrooms continued in academic and professional circles, but they became less urgent, less immediate. Sarah returned to the rhythms of regular life: school, therapy, family dinners, the small moments that constitute childhood for teenagers who have been through trauma. Officer and Justice continued their work as police K-9s, detecting drugs and explosives, providing security at events, serving their community in ways that transcended the one trial that had made them briefly famous. But something had shifted in his understanding of Justice's purpose. He began to recognize that the dog's role extended beyond the official job description, that Justice had something to offer to traumatized people that transcended training and protocol. For Sarah, the trial had not erased her trauma or magically healed her wounds, but it had provided something essential. It had provided validation that her voice mattered, that her truth had value, that the adults and systems designed to protect children could sometimes actually do their job. It had provided the knowledge that the man who had hurt her would face consequences for those actions. And in a way that she was only beginning to understand, it had provided the foundation upon which healing could be built. She still thought about Justice sometimes, about the way the dog's presence had grounded her when everything felt like it was falling apart, about the way a German shepherd's quiet strength had somehow made it possible for her to find her own voice. And she understood, in a way that transcended words, that the dog had given her a gift that went far beyond the confines of one trial in one courtroom. Justice had given her back to herself. 6 months after the trial, Sarah sat in her therapist's office in the same chair where she had sat countless times before, but she was different now in ways that were both obvious and subtle. Her selective mutism had gradually faded as she worked through her fear and grief with doctors' patient guidance. She still had hard days, still had nightmares that would jolt her awake in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, still had moments when the anxiety would suddenly spike without warning. But she was no longer trapped in the suffocating silence that had been her constant companion for 3 years. She had learned to speak about her trauma, not constantly or without effort, but with increasing fluency and decreasing shame. Doctor had noticed the changes accumulating over the months. Sarah's voice had grown stronger. She made more eye contact. She was beginning to develop a sense of humor, something that had seemed impossible in the immediate aftermath of the trial. In their sessions, they talked not just about the trauma and its processing, but also about Sarah's future, about the possibilities that were beginning to emerge as the weight of the past became slightly less crushing. "I was thinking," Sarah said during one of their sessions, her voice carrying the tentative quality that still characterized her speech but with an undercurrent of genuine interest. "I want to maybe volunteer at a place that helps kids who've been through stuff like I have. Not right now, but someday, when I'm older and more ready. I don't know if that makes sense." Doctor smiled, and Sarah could see genuine warmth and pride in the therapist's expression. "That makes complete sense," she said, "and it speaks to something really important that's happening inside you, the desire to transform your pain into purpose, to use what you've experienced to help others. That's a profound thing, Sarah." Officer and Justice had become minor celebrities in their community in the months following the trial, though both seemed relatively unmoved by the attention. Had been invited to speak at law enforcement conferences across the state, and had been instrumental in helping the courthouse develop formal protocols for allowing K-9 support animals during the testimony of traumatized victims. His presentations focused on trauma-informed approaches to justice, on the importance of meeting victims where they were emotionally, on the ways that unconventional accommodations could serve the interests of both justice and healing. Other jurisdictions began implementing similar programs. The police departments in 3 neighboring counties had reached out to requesting guidance on developing their own K-9 victim support protocols. A victim advocacy organization had approached him about partnering on a national training program for law enforcement officers interested in incorporating service animals into their trauma-informed practices. Justice, despite his humble nature and his preference for the simple life of a working dog, had inadvertently become the poster child for a movement toward more humane approaches to justice. The most meaningful moment came when Sarah's mother reached out to Officer and asked if there might be a possibility for Sarah to visit Justice one more time. Mrs. had facilitated the request, understanding the significance of what Sarah was asking for. Agreed immediately, touched by the request, but also understanding intuitively that Sarah needed something more than a brief courtroom encounter to complete her healing journey. The day arrived with clear skies and mild temperature, a perfect autumn afternoon. Sarah and her mother drove to the police K-9 unit facility on the outskirts of the city, a sprawling property with training grounds, kennels, and a main building where the handlers worked and coordinated their assignments. Sarah felt nervous as they pulled into the parking lot, her stomach fluttering with a combination of excitement and anxiety. She hadn't seen Justice since that day in the courtroom, when the dog's presence had somehow made it possible for her to speak her truth. Officer greeted them warmly, and Sarah could see recognition in his eyes, recognition of the girl she had been, and the young woman she was becoming. He led them through the facility to an outdoor area where Justice was waiting, having been brought from his kennel in preparation for their arrival. The moment Sarah saw Justice, she felt something release in her chest. The dog's physical presence was exactly as she remembered, the muscular frame, the alert ears, the intelligent dark eyes. But what struck her most powerfully was the recognition in the dog's body language as he spotted her. Justice's tail began to wag, and he moved towards Sarah with a directness that suggested genuine recognition and joy. Sarah knelt down as Justice approached, and the dog immediately pressed his head against her chest, his entire body relaxing into an expression of contentment that seemed almost human in its emotional clarity. Sarah wrapped her arms around the dog's neck and buried her face in his fur, feeling the warm solidity of him beneath her hands. She whispered something to him that Officer couldn't quite hear, but he saw tears streaming down Sarah's face, tears that seemed cleansing rather than traumatic, tears that spoke to emotional release and catharsis rather than pain and fear. When Sarah looked up, she was smiling. It was a genuine smile, not forced or performative, but real in a way that suggested the girl had accessed some part of herself that had been locked away since before the abuse began. "Thank you," she said to Officer, her voice steady and clear, "for believing in me, for understanding what I needed." Knelt down beside Sarah and Justice, and for a moment the three of them existed in a quiet space that felt sacred, felt like something important was being honored and acknowledged. "Justice did the believing," said gently. "I just brought him along. But I'm grateful too for your courage, for your strength, for showing all of us what's possible when a child is supported in telling her truth." Sarah and Justice spent the next hour together. They walked the property, Sarah's hand resting on the dog's back, their bodies moving in synchronized rhythm. They sat under a large oak tree, Sarah's head resting against Justice's side, while the dog's eyes remained alert and content. Sarah told Justice about school, about her therapy, about the small ways that her life was becoming more normal and more bearable. And Justice listened, as dogs do, with absolute presence and unconditional acceptance. As the afternoon began to fade into early evening, Sarah understood that it was time to leave. This wasn't goodbye exactly, but it was a closure of sorts, an acknowledgement that the particular role Justice had played in her life during the most acute phase of her trauma was complete. The dog had been a bridge between her fear and her courage. Now she had to walk forward on her own, carrying what Justice had given her, not in the form of the dog's continued physical presence, but in the form of the strength and self-belief that had emerged from their connection. Sarah stood up and Justice stood with her. She placed her hand on the dog's head and looked directly into his eyes. "You saved me," she said quietly. "I know that sounds dramatic, but it's true. You saved me." Officer understood that he was witnessing something profound, something that would stay with both Sarah and Justice for the rest of their lives. He also understood that this was a story that would continue to unfold, would continue to have impact, would continue to inspire changes in how the justice system approached child victims and traumatized witnesses. In the months and years that followed, Sarah would graduate from high school with honors. She would begin college with the goal of studying victim advocacy or trauma-informed psychology. She would eventually volunteer with an organization that supported child abuse survivors, and then go on to work professionally in that field. The trauma of her childhood would never completely disappear. Trauma leaves marks that don't fully heal, but it would transform into purpose, into meaning, into a dedication to helping others find their voices. Officer would eventually retire from active police work, but not before establishing a national training program for K-9 handlers interested in trauma-informed victim support. Justice would eventually retire from active duty as well, living out his remaining years within a comfortable home, where he was celebrated as the dog who had changed the trajectory of a child's life, and contributed to a broader transformation in how the justice system approached vulnerable witnesses. And in the courthouse where it had all happened, where a traumatized girl had pointed at a dog and spoken 2 words that changed everything, the accommodation that had been granted to Sarah became standard practice. Other children, other traumatized witnesses, would benefit from the precedent that her courage had established. The 2 words, "I'm sure," would echo forward through time, reminding everyone who encountered that story that a child's voice, supported properly, could move mountains. The journey from silence to speech, from victimhood to survival, from shame to healing, it was not a linear path, not a simple narrative with a neat resolution. But it was real, it was powerful, and it belonged to Sarah and to the remarkable dog who had seen her in her darkest moment and refused to let her be diminished or silenced.